Hello, my name is Nicholas Morgan. I'm an editor at Aval News, and this is Turkey Abroad. Joining me this morning is Caroline Rose. She is a senior analyst and head of the Strategic Vacuums program at the Newlines Institute for Strategy and Policy. Caroline, it's a pleasure to have you here.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
This week we saw the rocket attack that took place in Erbil, Iraqi Kurdistan's capital, and many have attributed this so far to an Iran-backed proxy inside of Iraq. And I saw this week, shortly after the attack, you co-authored a really great analysis, actually, with the Newsline Institute after the attack that assessed that Iran was using these kind of rocket attacks to undermine not just the usual target, of course, the United States, but also Turkey, which I found really interesting to hear, especially since just a few days before we had the fallout of the operation against the PKK that found 13 dead Turkish hostages. And what I want to ask you, Caroline, is with the given all the tension between the U.S. and Iran inside of Iraq, which is pretty well known, where does Turkey factor into this competition to you?
Yes, so it's a good point. The piece that Russia and we authored, it essentially examines the not just the relationship that these Iran aligned militias that are part of the axis of the resistance against the United States. They're starting to turn their attention more towards the Kurdish region of Iraq, at the KRG government, and then, like you mentioned, Turkey. And this was a subtle message that these Iran aligned militias, specifically Awliya al-Dam, which was the specific militia that took responsibility for the Erbil attack. And the message that they're trying to send to Ankara is essentially, don't mess with us in the KRI. Don't mess with us in Iraqi Kurdistan, because we understand that there are intentions, or there have been signals that Turkey wishes to support, logistics and operations against PKK insurgents in the district of Sinjar and the Nineveh province in more broadly, and that these Iraqi militias, or these Iran-aligned Iraqi militias, they're beginning to form new alliances with some of the PKK affiliated organizations that are operating in that district. So we're starting to see quite a big shift in the security landscape of northern Iraq, in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. And not only are you starting to see this alliance, but also you're starting to see signals put out by Erdogan and some of his foreign policy team that they're hoping to support operations, and supporting the upholding the Sinjar agreement, which was agreed last October of last year. And so there could be a potential escalation, and I think that these Iraqi militias, they're aware of that there's a potential for escalation. So they're looking towards attacks, and they're looking towards threatening messages, and these warning shots against Turkey to essentially stave them from undergoing any kind of serious offensive over Sinjar.
Hmm. On that note, that's something that really stood out to us. Actually, was some of the comments that were coming out of these Iranian-backed militias inside of Iraq in the aftermath of last week's hostage rescue operation. And some of them responded by threatening Turkey outright if any more actions were to be taken inside of Iraq. And in one case, they even compared them to the United States. They bunched them in together as the same kind of occupying force. What how should we interpret this though? Is this something that's in any way independent on the part of the militias, or would you say that it's Iran's way of passing this warning along, basically, to Turkey, that they do not want to see any more escalation inside of Iraqi Kurdistan? I mean, you mentioned that for Iran, it's important to remind Turkey that they have their own limits there. But how do we understand these comments coming straight from the militias?
So it's very complex, right? Because you can't necessarily formally establish the link and the evidence immediately between some of these rogue militias and the IRGC leadership in Tehran. But at the same time, I think you have to look at this logically, and you have to look at the Erbil attack and say, well, how could a small militia pull off an attack on such a high value target such as Erbil? I mean, Erbil is the location of a lot of high level joint operation training centers for the United States, the Joint Coalition Task Force, the Operation Inherent Resolve. There's a very valued partnership between the United States and the KRG, and then of course, as you mentioned, there's also a partnership between the KRG and Turkey as well. So Erbil is very high value. It's just as high value as the Al Assad base was last year, right after the Soleimani attacks. I mean, it was it's a very strategic location, and it's a symbolic location. So when you look at that and you say, okay, how could a newly formed militia like Awliya al-Dam, not only carry out, but also conduct an operation like that without at least the knowledge of Iran? It's possible that they acted independently. We've seen this before when Iran and the U.S. tried to broker a ceasefire, in the fall of last year. And some militias, especially militias related to AAH, which is a faction of the PMF, they just simply didn't abide by that agreement. So it's possible that Iran may not necessarily be behind this direct message. So it's important that you don't necessarily jump to that point quite yet. But Iran and Turkey are rivals in the region. There's limited cooperation. We've seen Turkey and Iran cooperate in the Kandil Mountains to a very limited extent, when there was supporting artillery fire, between the Turkish, Iraqi, and Iranian border.
And that was last summer, right? Or if correct me if I'm wrong.
Absolutely, that was last summer, and Iran cooperated to a certain extent with trying to counter some of the PKK related groups that were residing in Iran, and they were going through two different border lines to essentially help with supply and logistics and some of these operations that the PKK was conducting. And so there was limited cooperation there, and so you can't necessarily say that both states don't share some of the same imperatives. But Iran, when they're looking at what Turkey is signaling in northern Iraq, it's essentially an extension of the security corridor that Turkey established in Syria. And that's one of their greatest fears, is that if Turkey gets really great control over not only its southern border, but then also the northern border of Iraq, and they extend that security corridor that they have in northeast Syria into Iraq. They use it as kind of this buffer zone with Iraq. But then on top of that, they undermine the control and the influence that the Shiite resistance militias have in Nineveh province and the Sinjar district and some of these pockets of insecurity. That's not within the interest of Iran. They want to undermine the Iraqi security landscape from the south to the north, and to the east, to the west. They want to ensure that, because that's their doorstep into the Mediterranean, into the Lebanons, the Syrias, where they can also continue to wield control, where they can get further port access, where they can continue their illicit market activity.
Israel.
Yeah, exactly. So, and northern Iraq is part of that, even though they haven't really had as much of a presence as they have had in the south. But it's important for them that they get that. So, and I think too, the Turkey signal and Erdogan signal of an operation in northern Iraq, it's not necessarily taken lightly, because there's a very large possibility that Turkey will seek to stay, either to the medium to the long term, and either establish outposts or try and establish a more informal security corridor. But either way, it's just not within Tehran's interest, and it's especially not in these militias' interest either.
This begs a question that I'd also like you to get your take on, actually, and it's related to the KRG itself. We know that both Turkey and Iran were opposed to its independence referendum back in 2017, of course. But at the same time, they both have their own separate relationships with the KRG. After Soleimani was killed, the KRG found itself in that really uncomfortable space between the US and Iran. If I remember correctly, the Iranian retaliation strikes were launched at the Erbil base of the coalition forces. And of course, the KRG has a long history of cooperating with Turkey, even if it might be made uneasy by some of its strikes against the PKK and its affiliates inside the region. So what I want to ask you, Caroline, is like, can you briefly explain what you see as like the main differences in, say, Turkey's relationship with the KRG versus Iran's?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good point. So Turkey has a very key interest with the KRG in cooperating against these PKK groups and insurgents. Most importantly, in addition to the security relationship, is the economic relationship that they have with the KRG. It's an opportunity really for Turkey to infiltrate that market, to try and export some of their important goods, to establish infrastructural projects, to essentially ensure there's border security, to have a partner on the other side of the border that is cooperating in operations like, or at least supportive of operations like Operation Claw, and Claw Eagle, Claw Tiger, and all of the other successive
What other
operations.
animals we're getting to?
Exactly. So it's that's Turkey's key imperative with the KRG. Iran is a bit more complex, and Iran, their interest, kind of echoing my previous point about what they're trying to do with the security landscape. They want to cooperate with the KRG to an extent, but they also want to expose some of the divisions between Baghdad and Erbil with the federal government and the KRG. And, for example, with the Sinjar agreement, which was brokered between the federal government and the KRG, if there's success with that, that would not only ensure that the KRG has control over some of these provinces that are disputed, but then also that the federal government would also have kind of a winning hand in some of this. In the Sinjar agreement, it ensured that Baghdad would also have input on political appointments and the appointment of the mayor of Sinjar, and it would kind of reassert some of federal control, not complete federal control, but it would allow Baghdad to have more of an influence than it has had in the past few years, really in the past like decade or so. And so agreements like that also threatens Iran, and that's really affected their relationship with the KRG. So they're much more careful. They don't necessarily have the same interests, much less like Turkey and the KRG do right now, especially with countering PKK and economic interests. So they're a bit more cautious with how they proceed with the KRG and the ruling KDP party.
Mhm. And you mentioned it a few times already, the Sinjar agreement actually, and we've covered the developments on that agreement, and we had a podcast actually a few months ago on the topic as well. And of course, it was one of those rare agreements, of course, where you had the U.S., the UN, the Iraqi federal government, and Turkey all on the same page with the KRG about what to do in that case. And I want to ask you is like, do you think that with everything going on right now, this amount of tension, whether it's between the U.S. and Iran, or Turkey and Iran, or the PKK and Turkey, whoever it might be, do you think it's creating a risk that this agreement is threatened, that it could potentially collapse?
Absolutely, because I mean, at the end of the day, the Sinjar agreement, their top priority was to counter not only PKK insurgents, but then also some of the Iran-based Shia militias from the region, and the Iran-aligned Shia militias that are operating under the Hashad al-Shabi, the PMF. And recently, especially in the wake after the Erbil attack, there's been a lot of indication that Iran aligned militias have started mobilizing to Sinjar or trying to, increase propagandic messages and really try and, essentially influence what's going to happen over, over Sinjar district and the Nineveh province in general. For example, there was a Sinjar force that was kind of informally established from the Hezbollah brigades, and they deployed to South Sinjar. And this new force is said to have really warm relations with some PKK-backed groups like the YBS, that really can affect whether they'll be able to uphold the agreement. So I don't really think there's going to be a lot of success, at least in the immediate future, even if Turkey doesn't necessarily get involved in Sinjar directly. Even if there's not a confrontation, you're starting to see more militias pour into Sinjar, which effectively is going to undermine any kind of control that Erbil and Baghdad wished to assert over Sinjar. So just their presence alone complicates the deal and makes it a lot less likely to succeed.
Mhm. Just hold on. It's also interesting that you mentioned earlier already that Iran or some of its proxies are working together a little bit more with the PKK and some of their affiliates inside of inside of Iraq. And this is a view that at least some Turkish analysts have shared also, that Iran was being supportive or accommodating of the PKK. And I wanted to ask you also, last year, given what we already talked about, where Turkey and Iran have cooperated to some extent against whether it's the PKK itself or its affiliates like the PJAK. They both seem to have their separate concerns related to the Kurdish groups. Can you go into more detail what those mean to you? Like, what does this new cooperation between Iran and some of these PKK linked groups mean, and what does it speak to?
Regarding the link between these PMF groups and the PKK, again, I think that there's also kind of like the Turkish-Iranian relationship. There is limited cooperation, right? Because with a potential Turkish offensive in Sinjar, there's something to unite against. But at the end of the day, there are going to be disputes over how to control, how to essentially divide and conquer parts of Nineveh province, and that's going to be highly complex for a lot of the Sinjar residents and actors that are trying to assert political control over Sinjar, just because these groups have very divergent interests on how to rule and what territories to control. So honestly, Turkey doesn't necessarily make a move in Sinjar. And if the Peshmerga forces don't move in, and if Baghdad doesn't necessarily make a move, Sinjar could still be highly unstable anyways, just because you have two groups that have cooperated and have joined, they've created an informal front against these outside actors. But at the end of the day, like, it's not a lasting front. It's not a lasting alliance. And it's very highly possible that, more insecurity could break out just because of this. Because now all of a sudden you have this huge influx of Shiite militias that have essentially moved into Sinjar, and they may leave, but they also may try and assert further authority and control there, because Sinjar is strategic for them, just because, again, they undermine KRG's control. They undermine any kind of symbolic federal government control, and it's also a very strategic location in the north where they can also essentially a security vacuum or create an enclave of governance that they can use to further operations and support into the operations in Syria. So it's very valuable for them to do that. So the exact nature of these relationships, they're definitely on shaky ground. There are these ED regiments within the PMF. They've also done some, new and tied to different tribes that are close to the YBS. So, the lines are kind of blurring right now, but I feel like if they're in the event of there not being an offensive, there will be a lot of fragmentation, and you'll start to see kind of an exacerbated divide between both forces.
There's one more thing I'd also like to ask you, and it's that it now ties back into the triangle we have here now between Iran, the U.S., and Turkey. And even if Iran has been the aggressor towards both of them inside of Iraq, whether it's the attack on Erbil or the consistent attacks against coalition forces, the it doesn't of course paper off some of the differences, at least between the US and Turkey. Just I think it was yesterday, Erdogan said that the US Turkey relationship is stronger than any of its differences, which is a pretty generous statement right now given the last few years of discord between the two of them. And just a few days earlier, his outrage over the conditional US condemnation of the PKK operation in Gare. And in your last article, you mentioned that with recent events should prompt the U.S. to engage in a bit of a rethink on its policy or lack of policy inside of Iraq. Do you think, given the mutual tensions right now, even between Turkey and Iran, or this desire on the part of Turkey to, paper over some of its differences with the U.S. under Joe Biden, do you think that there is actually any space for the U.S. and Turkey to really work together closer in this area?
100%. I think the fact that if these forces, if Iran starts to get more aggressive with countering Turkey in the north, the US will have to force itself to recalculate its relationship with Turkey to an extent. I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean that there has to be a solidified front against these groups. The US is drawing down anyway. NATO presence is increasing while that's happening. There doesn't necessarily have to be a very solidified front against Iran with Turkey, but it definitely means that the US will have to cooperate and at least find consensus with Turkey on this, just because um, Turkish cooperation will be important to counter some of these Shiite militias and at least ensure that the Iraqi forces will be able to further develop and essentially establish command and control, and have assert control over its ports and control over its borders. And I think, but at the same time, the U.S. should be wary of Turkey as well, because they did not support some elements of Operation Claw, and how it violated Iraqi territorial sovereignty. And they are worried that Turkey will try and assert what it, the same campaign that it did in northern Syria and northeast Syria as well, with the corridor. And so the US, I think, wants to achieve a very careful balance with Turkey, encouraging them and supporting them in operations that may counter Shiite militias and allow the KDP and the KRG to essentially assert control back over these areas that are within their periphery. But at the same time, the U.S. will want to ensure that Turkey is not, essentially committing like a Syria 2.0 in northern Iraq. I think that's going to be a very big concern. So that might be one of the biggest constraints of the relationship, in fact, just because the U.S. is the relationship that they have with the KRG, and the relationship that they have with Kurdish militants and Kurdish factions in Syria. They really want to ensure that Turkey is not necessarily perpetrating the same campaign that they did just 2 years ago. So,
Caroline, I really do appreciate having you on Turkey Abroad for this program and touching on the events this week. There is absolutely going to be more to discuss down the line in this area. So, I really look forward to inviting you back and hearing what you have to say there.
it was great being on. Thank you so much for having me. This was a pleasure.
My name is Nicholas Morgan, and this is Turkey Abroad.